Welcome to Global Development Review, the podcast where we explore key global issues. I'm your host, Jaffer Latief Najar, and in this episode, we ask is the rule based world order diminishing in 2025? To help us unpack this, I'm honored to welcome Professor Richard Falk, a leading voice in international law and global governance. Professor Richard Falk is Professor Emeritus at Princeton University, where he taught for over 40 years, and a former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestinian Human Rights. With over 50 books and countless articles, Professor Falk has shaped major debates on global justice, human rights, nuclear disarmament, and world order. Beyond academia, he has actively contributed to global activism, serving as chair of Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and working on key international commissions, including the Independent International Commission on Kosovo. As the global tension rises and multilateral institutions face challenges, we explore whether the rule based world order is eroding or what the future holds. Stay with us for a thought provoking conversation with one of the world's foremost scholars and thinkers, Professor Richard Falk. Professor Richard Falk, first of all, welcome to Global Development Review podcast. Thank you very much for accepting my request to join, and I'm really delighted to have you here on my show.
It's my pleasure to be your guest today.
Thanks. Professor Richard Falk, President Trump has recently re-elected as President of United States for the second term and has already announced aggressive reforms and claims like buying Gaza. And I mean, just connecting with the latest news of yesterday, so the world has watched how they had like heated debates with the president of Ukraine, and apart from that, the world is witnessing the genocide of Palestinian in Gaza, and there is ongoing war going on between Russia and Ukraine, and we have seen Afghans are in Afghanistan, Taliban's are back. Syria is also seeing the change in transition. Bangladesh has seen Kashmir is completely silenced. Their regional autonomy and statehood is already being revoked by Indian government. Conflicts persisting in Sudan and other numerous other crises and colonial repressions and human rights violations are unfolding globally. And given this entire situation, what is happening across the world, uh, but it seems no one is listening to and bothering about the international laws and the rule of the law. So, given this widespread instability and disregard for international law, would it be fair to say that the rule-based world order is diminishing in 2025?
Well, I think there's no question that the so-called rule governed world, always an ambiguous terminology, because it was not clear ever in its usage that it referred to international law rather than to some geopolitical norms set by the powerful countries in the world. When Biden was the US president, it was given a lot of emphasis, and particularly using this phrase, rule governed world, rather than committing itself to an international law governed world. And so that it showed, at least to some of us who were critical, that there was a growing gap between these so-called rules and the requirements of international law. With Trump, you have an exaggerated, undisguised recourse to an imperial style of global governance in which issues of global security and war prevention are addressed as issues of power and of great power discretion and not questions of rights or rules that are embedded in international law or the UN Charter. So it's very important to understand that we now are living in a world that is only governed with ideas of the applicability of international law imposed on the weak by the strong, or in situations that are not in the substantive domain of either global security or war prevention. And there is a certain kind of international law or rule governance for a whole series of other international interactions, ranging from diplomacy to tourism to much of commercial connections between different actors from different countries. But on these crucial questions bearing on Gaza and, as you suggest, Kashmir, Western Sahara, and Ukraine, the governance is geopolitical, not international norm. International norms are at the margins, they're not respected, but the interplay of geopolitical forces is what's determining the historical encounter's outcome.
We are also witnessing the rise of China on the other side. So, if I just may ask that, is the global world order undergoing some transition with some emerging new imperial powers challenging the conventional imperial hegemony of United States and other regions and regimes of Western powers, especially global North? So, could you see that transition, is such transition happening, or it's like still the power remains in the West?
I think there are two broad alternative geopolitical arrangements that are currently under consideration by these leading governments. The first of which is, as you suggest, a kind of encounter that some have called a second Cold War or a new Cold War, and it would involve either the opposition of the US to a coalition of China and Russia, or possibly a coalition between the US and Russia against China. There are two variations of this kind of Cold War sequel to the period after the first Cold War, when the US had virtually no competition for its role as the dominant geopolitical actor. That competition arose economically and technologically from China, and in a sense, militarily from Russia in the February 2022 with the attack on Ukraine. The second alternative is an avoidance of this kind of repetition of the Cold War, and a geopolitical alliance between these three countries, US, Russia, China, and a bypassing of Europe and of other kinds of coalitions, and this providing a kind of governance structure for the world that doesn't depend on international law or on the role of the United Nations, but is a matter of geopolitical management of the future of global security and war prevention.
So, what impact do you see that it is going to have on the larger global landscape? So, who is going to suffer and who is going to stay in power? And yeah, it seems like a fight of powerful nations, and those who are at the margin are going to affect more in near future as well.
Well, it does have the appearance of being a kind of second coming of colonial ideas of dominance and economic exploitation of the weak and vulnerable, and the pressure on Ukraine to give up their valuable earth materials to the US in exchange for security, supposedly, is a kind of indicator. And China's aggressive attitude toward the disputes in the uh, South and East China Seas over the control of island resources of various sorts is another indication. And you can look at the Russian attack on Ukraine with the objective of permanently controlling the Donbass region, where the economic wealth of Ukraine is concentrated, especially toward industrial development. All of these seem to suggest that an economic exploitative dimension to such a geopolitical coalition. It is also important to take account of what happens with the BRICS coalition, that is also China and Russia are part of it, but it is a counter to the US dominance after the Cold War, and particularly a challenge to the control of the world economy through the dollar being the reserve currency used for international trade and investment. That challenge would diminish the influence and control of the US externally. And the way Trump has acted in these early period probably encourages a stronger challenge from the BRICS countries, or some kind of renewal of the non-aligned movement in the global South. So the period ahead in the rest of 2025 is one that is likely to have some surprises for the world. And it's very uncertain how these various complex factors will work out in the near and more distant future. But it is a time when the US post-Cold War dominance has been seriously challenged for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Can we say that challenge, from the competitors or from the other powers is also forcing US to bring the more, strong laws, like they are coming up with the strong anti-immigration policies as well. And also, is it fair enough to say that era of colonialism and settler colonialism is expanding or again, becoming more dominant?
Well, certainly, if you consider the Israel and the support it's received from the Western former colonial powers and the breakaway British colonial states of US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you see a civilizational clash between the West, the white West, particularly Islam and the Islamic countries, and all the pressure on behalf of the Palestinian struggle comes from Islamic sources, Iran on the one side and the various movements in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. They are all Islamic in their orientation. The regimes, the Arab regimes, are more conservative in the sense of relying on military power to control their own people and making security arrangements with the West, particularly the US. And so you have unusual situation that it is non-governmental Islamic movements that have been more active in the defense of Palestinian rights than have the Islamic governments or the Islamic organization, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And that's probably a surprise, though it's for many people, but it shouldn't be if you understand the politics of the Islamic world, which depends on regimes that are not necessarily seen as legitimate by their own populations and by elites that are making their strength depend on positive external relations with global economic forces, both corporate and financial and governmental. So you have a very complex world situation.
You have already mentioned that people may have some different sentiment as compared to the regimes or the government they have. So I'm just wondering, like governments like the Islamic nations, who seems to have very powerful space and as a body, they are representing around 50 plus countries. Are they also somehow have weakened, in the process of resistance to colonial aggressions?
I think that settler colonialism is something that probably will not occur in the near future beyond Israel as a prime case of settler colonialism coming as the earlier forms of colonialism were dying and being challenged. So it came at a time when the peoples who were being colonized were rising up and resisting. And that meant that the Palestinian people were in a situation that went against the tide of history, the flow of history, and which was anti-colonial after 1945, with the exception of the establishment and rise of Israel as a military power in the region. I don't think that there are other settler colonial projects of any significance that are underway. It would be a north-south process, and there seems not to be any enthusiasm for a reestablishment of the kind of territorial colonialism that existed in the 18th and 19th century and were gradually challenged in the 20th century. I don't see that as being reproduced. Rather, I see this kind of combination of the US as a global state, non-territorial global state with its military capabilities spread out over the oceans and through military bases and special forces on the land territory of much of the global South. So I see, in other words, a different pattern of exploitation and domination in the 21st century than what occurred during the historic colonial, settler colonial period. And that is now, I think, under challenge from the global South, but whether that challenge has enough coherence and capabilities to offset the economic and cultural and geopolitical power of the US and, in a different way, China and Russia, remains a big question for the future.
There are a lot of research and literature going on about colonial and settler colonialism within the countries of the global south, which are being dominated by the powerful countries of global south, and there are also movements against it. What is your perspective on this? That those countries who are emerging as the new powers of the global south, somehow they have also you know uh, reinvented the colonialism within the global south countries.
Yeah, yes, I think there are a lot of issues in the global South about uh, dealing with what I call colonialism after colonialism, which is partly a matter of questioning and eliminating post colonial efforts at control and exploitation, which the African countries, particularly, have been trying to address in relation to France, particularly, but also the UK. I mean that both of these former colonial powers, through the elite structures in these African countries, and through security arrangements, retain a lot of their exploitative, privileged access to the resources of these countries. And therefore, you do really have something additional to settler colonialism and traditional colonialism in the form of what might be called colonialism after colonialism, this retention of the colonial privileges, but in a framework that is formally one of political independence and state sovereignty, so that the question of whether countries achieve the substance of independence or only the formal grant of independence without realizing the full benefits of independence. I think that's, and also what sometimes after Frantz Fanon has been called the colonization of the colonial mind, which didn't end the day colonialism as a mode of direct control ended, and requires a kind of post-liberation mentality that hasn't emerged in many countries because of corruption, because of foreign influence and manipulation. So there is, in a sense, an unrealized potential for the global South and a danger of a new kind of subordination of the global South to these geopolitical actors, especially the US.
I will just come to the question of United Nations, and you have served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for many years and have contributed a lot regarding this Palestine issue and human rights situation in occupied territories. Over the last 2 years, we have seen so many, orders and from the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, so many appeals, and but it seems not working well. So, is the United Nations losing its influence, power, and diplomacy? And how do you see the future of United Nations? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a important and difficult question, and I think the future, to come to that aspect, is at the present time very uncertain on the level of challenges to human well-being. The UN was never more needed. But in terms of the attitudes of these geopolitical actors, they and other states as well, like India and some of the countries in Europe, they're very anti-internationalist at this point. And there's a rebirth of very strong autocratic structures, anti-democratic structures of ultranationalism that work against commitments to an international approach to common problems. And the Trump administration here in the US is a prime example of this new form of ultranationalism that is quite open about saying what's good for America is good for the world, and what's bad for America will not be tolerated in the rest of the world. So it's a form of governance that is internally very repressive and internationally very domineering and short-sighted. It doesn't pay attention to the ecological challenges facing humanity, which require cooperation and an internationalist approach. Having said that, it's important to appreciate that the UN was designed after World War II to serve the cause of the winners of the war, not of the overall human community. And that is epitomized by the fact that in the Security Council, the five winning countries in World War II were given the power of the veto, which in effect frees them from an obligation to respect the UN Charter or international law or some kind of neutral idea of rule governance in the world. So the UN was not designed to achieve control over global security or war prevention, despite what the preamble in the UN Charter promises. It was designed to allow these winners of the war to shape the future global policy and to ensure the continuation of what I call the primacy of geopolitics. In other words, giving the power a dominant role over the control of behavior by some kind of universal regulative framework. This pattern is something that is very difficult to challenge because it's very hard to change the framework of the UN without the consent of those countries that have it both ways, both the operational convenience of the UN and a freedom from its control. And that's, in a way, an intolerable system if you're really trying to make the world respond to the priorities for the human public good. The UN is not able to do that for these big issues. It can do many useful things for less prominent policy questions in the area of human rights, culture, children, health, environment, but it cannot deal with these central issues. And that's what is very disturbing. It seems difficult to reform and needing reform. I've recently published a book with a German colleague called The Future of the UN, Realism with Hope, which tries to examine these issues that your question raises.
If you would like to share something more about that book, I really would be happy to hear about it.
Well, I think the only thing I would add is that my collaborator, Hans van Spanik, was a UN high-level civil servant for 37 years and speaks with an awareness of the failures and the successes of the UN over this period. He's one of the few high UN civil servants to have resigned on principle while administering the so-called oil for food program after the Iraq war because he felt it was being manipulated by geopolitical powers in ways that were not consistent with the humanitarian objectives of the program. And so we try to bring both a humanistic and a realistic view together in suggesting that the peoples of the world would be much better off with a stronger, more effective UN in these areas of global security, ecological well-being, human rights, war prevention, but that's very difficult to realize because of the rigidity of the UN structure. So it depends on a popular movement that can change the attitude and the behavior of these resisting governments. And it should be pointed out that international criminal law, which governs accountability for the violations of international law, was initiated in a very public way at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials of war criminals after World War II, but again, in a way that exempted the winners of the war. So, in other words, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was never treated or examined as a violation of the law of war, but the crimes of the losers were not only investigated but punished, and the convicted individuals of them who governed the who held high positions in the German and Japanese command structures were punished often by death. So you had this, again, winner's approach to the development of international law, which is a incoherent way of developing law, which has as its integral principle the obligation to treat equals equally. See, both in the UN and in the Nuremberg Tokyo trials, equals were treated unequally, and therefore it's questionable as a institution and as a precedent for the future.
What would be your advice to younger generation, especially the progressive youth who are losing hope and amid these ongoing colonial projects, genocides, enforced silencing, and human rights violations, while facing also limited space to resist and speak? Any kind of advice from your side?
Yes, well, it's of course a challenging question, and I don't have a crystal ball that sees the future clearly. In some ways, that's an advantage because the future, if it's a continuation of the present, is rather depressing and discouraging. But I think the main emphasis I would give to younger people who have these values and concerns, which I see very clearly present in the younger generation in the US and elsewhere where I've given talks and participated in seminars, there is a strong recognition that we need a better future than the present. And I would add that we don't know enough about the future to be altogether pessimistic, that we should do our best to stay engaged as citizens, not just be detached and watch the future unfold, but to try to engage in a struggle, whatever form it takes, in creating this better future and understanding what a better future is and making it part of the political demands that one makes of one's own government. And so the whole idea of a humane future depends on action from a very local place to a very global place. In other words, all of these contexts of behavior become highly relevant in trying to reshape the future to accord more fully with humane and ecologically coherent values, that otherwise the species itself, beyond the well-being of individual countries, is at threat. It's a threat from either the outbreak of major warfare or ecological collapse of one sort or another. And these issues are not receiving at the present time the attention they deserve from the leaders of the world. And that creates a kind of denial of reality. And it's a very dangerous time when the leadership that we need is nowhere to be found. And therefore, it has to come from below, from the peoples of the world, who must be mobilized in their own self-interest and not just be subsidiary to the governments and elites that now exert control over their lives and over the future.